Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz singer Stacey Kent. She is a singer in the mold of the greats with a legion of fans worldwide, a host of honors and awards, including a Grammy nomination, album sales that are in the excess of 2 million, gold, double gold, and platinum selling albums that have reached a series of #1 chart positions. She's had a very, very interesting ride, and she talked about all of that along with her latest album, the CD I Know, I Dream, the Orchestral Sessions. It got 5 stars in Downbeat, won the Album of the Year in the vocal category at the 2017 Jazz Japan Awards, and she is always captivating the crowds as a performer. So get to know her and dig this interview, my friends. Thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz.
It's a pleasure.
So I want to go ahead and dive right into your album, I Know I Dream, the Orchestral Sessions, and I've really had a chance to wrap my head around it, and it's such a magnanimous melding of both the jazz and the classical world. So I want to know with you, what was kind of your vision for this and how you want the listener to feel after they consume this album?
Yeah, I really like this question, and I love talking about this because this was a project that was a long time coming and in the works before we got into the studio. You know, it's not every day that you're going to make an album with, 58 other musicians. To put all that time into it is really worthwhile to get it exactly as you want. And also, recording with an orchestra, it's kind of like the construction of a building. You wouldn't just say to your architect, okay, go. Because when those arrangements start to be written out, and crafted, there's so much work that goes into so many parts and so many specifics in the harmony that you really want to make sure that you're going down the right path before you set it in stone, And I think that Jim's in my vision, and when I talk about Jim, it's Jim Tomlinson, who's the sax player in my band and also my husband and my producer and the songwriter. We had a very specific vision, and that is to say that with orchestral albums, the ones that are the most successful to us in our minds, I'm not talking about, sales and financial success, I'm talking about musical success, of course, are the ones where you really get a great marriage between the vocalist, the artist, and the orchestrations and the arrangements. Because there's so much you can do with an orchestra, and in fact the danger is that you can do too much, because there's so much possibility to write and overwrite. And the kind of singer that I am, I'm a very intimate song singer and storyteller, and we didn't want the story to get lost. And so the people that we looked to, who really were our inspirations, happened to come from Brazil. People like João Gilberto and Tom Jobim. When you see these guys up on stage, João often with just his guitar, or João with a full orchestra, he's still João Gilberto, very much at the center. The sensibility doesn't change. The way in which he delivers doesn't change. He just happens to be embellished by this vast orchestra. Same thing with Jobim. There's so much minimalism, there's so much space, and yet there's so much going on at the same time. And so those were really our inspirations. What's interesting about this, and you talked about, where jazz meets classical, the people that I'm talking about, Jobim primarily as a songwriter and arranger, who is really one of my greatest heroes of them all, is also downwind of that classical world. His influences come from the French Impressionism, from Ravel and Debussy and Villa-Lobos and Chopin, and I come from that world as well, so I already felt like we crossed paths along this path several times. And so it was very easy to look to them and think that I didn't have to be overpowered as the singer just because I happened to have 58 people. When I say overpowered, I mean, just over-embellished. And that can happen. This wasn't a swooping, sweeping, dramatic Hollywood score. This was supposed to be a world that the listener could enter into. When you asked me the question about, when you added that tag about how I wanted people to feel, I wanted people to be able to sit down and listen to this record and feel as if they were listening to the kind of record that I've made for them before, or the kind of experience they have when they come to see us live before, which is to say that it can be still very intimate, still very much that story and storytelling aspect at the center, and yet with all of this color around me. I know this is a very long answer, but one more thing I'll add. To sing already is such a visual experience. I know that sounds kind of abstract and wishy-washy, but I find it so visual, and I think I tend to gravitate towards material that is very visual, that is very cinematic. There's a lot of great metaphor and beautiful images written by my poets. Whether it be a Vinicius de Moraes lyric or a Jobim lyric or Ishiguro lyric from a Tomlinson song. And to sing with orchestra is all the more visual. So it's, I was choosing songs and orchestrations that gave it that very visual experience.
Well, I think I don't think I've heard it described in that way, but it is visual. It's like reading a book. You're constructing this world based on words, and the words that you use are very poetic, so it all makes total sense.
I'm so glad you say that, because that is what it's like for me. I'm a big cinema lover, and one of the things I talk about with Jim and with Kazuo Ishiguro, who writes the lyrics for the Tomlinson Ishiguro songs, is, and Ish is also a novelist and a screenwriter. I'm literally transported into this world, and I want to take people with me into this world. And so I opened the album, well, that's with a Jobim song, and I knew, even before we started to record, I knew this was going to be the opener, as long as it came out well, because you don't know what's going to happen in the studio, was Double Rainbow, because it's so evocative, and it has the words, "Listen, the rain is falling on the roses," which is already so playful because, of course, we're listening to the rain falling on the roses. And it's such an invitation. And I thought that was those were the perfect words to open out into this world. And then, we could take this journey to all of these wonderful places with these songs that are, I can't think of a better word for it than cinematic. And so when we talked to Jim and I sat down with Tommy Lawrence. Going back to your first part of the question, Tommy Lawrence, Jim did some of the arrangements, and then Tommy Lawrence did the majority of them. It was very important that we sit down and we talk a long time and cited examples and really understood that we were on the same page. Because, as I referred to the architect earlier, once you start to write all of that down, it's hard to go backwards, So you need to know that you're in the right place from the beginning. And we were very careful to make sure that we really understood where we wanted to go together, and sent him different examples of the things that we do like, the things that we don't think work. That was very useful, and that's why it took so long to make, so that we could really make sure we were ready to just, press go and go forth.
The one thing about this album is you got a 5-star review from Downbeat, you've won awards, you've been recognized. I know that's not the end game, but that has to validate a lot.
Oh, sure. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not wonderful. A few months ago, I got the call that this won Jazz Japan Jazz Vocal Album of the Year, and the Downbeat review came in. Those happened around the same time, I think, early in the winter. I was thrilled because this was a dream come true album to make. So, no, of course it feels great to win those, to have that recognition. And yet, it is so far from what drives you. And I can tell you honestly that when I was starting out, and before I had the career that I have now, and I was sitting in a cafe on Wednesdays and Fridays with a guitarist singing in a corner of a place called Café Bohème in London, when I was just getting started, and Ronnie Scott hadn't hired me yet, and I hadn't been to any other countries yet. Hand on heart, I was so exhilarated to be able to make music and share music. And maybe 17 people would come in the cafe, and they would sit, we were regulars, and they were regulars, and they would come and sit and listen to us play and play and play. It was thoroughly inspiring. It was what I wanted to do. And I've never forgotten what it is that I want to do. I love to tell stories. I love to share music. There is nothing more beautiful than that. And particularly, the world goes through these waves of crazy times, doesn't it? You just want to make people feel good, feel better, forget whatever's going on. I don't mean, that it has to be some big, drastic, terrible thing going on, but, the traffic jam, the broken toaster, or something more drastic than that, to make people feel good, because it makes me feel so good. I knew as a kid that when I entered into a world in music, when I would come home after school and close the door to my bedroom and put on my music and just enter into that world, and it made me feel so much. I knew that I wanted to do the same thing for other people. And so that is really the most gratifying part. And, so you set out on a journey to make a record, and you hope when you launch it into the world that it does just that. The other thing is you don't know where it's going. You don't know, once you launch it and it's out in the world, you don't know how it affects people's lives. And I'll tell you one little anecdote that just sticks with me. There are so many. I meet so many beautiful people, at signings after the shows, and we talk, or they'll be resourceful and they'll find us on the internet and tell me their personal stories. But there's one that was so beautiful recently, and a guy, it's actually not so recent. I don't know why I just said that. It feels like it was recent, but it wasn't. The guy wrote me afterwards. I did meet him after the show, but he wrote me this letter on Facebook, and he said that his daughter had wanted to come to the show, and she was too little, so he didn't bring her. He had asked me for a request, and I had played the request. And the point was, he got home, and his little girl had fallen asleep on the couch. I guess the babysitter didn't put her into bed. He picked her up to put her into bed, and she woke up just enough. She said to her father, "Did she sing it?" And he said yes. And she smiled and fell back asleep on his shoulder, and then he put her to bed. The story is so beautiful because here's a guy who's got this beautiful relationship with this little girl, and they share this love of one of my songs, and she wanted me to sing it for him that night at a show that she wasn't allowed to come to. And then I am in a privileged position to find out, they shared this moment at 11 p.m. on his way home from the show. And the fact that I get to have these little glimmers into people's lives, that they share this with me, shows just how reciprocal it is. I'm on stage and I'm giving something to the people who come, but they give something back to me. It's a very shared experience, and I can't think of anything nicer to do than that.
That's a great story. I love it. So speaking of being a little girl, you grew up on the East Coast. So tell me how you got into music, more specifically jazz, and what singers or jazz musicians really got you going in the beginning?
Well, when I was a kid, I gravitated towards music, and I can't really answer the question as to why, because who knows why one kid sits down in front of a television and starts to, draw what he sees, because he's just got an eye to brain to fingers connection. For me, it was music. We would go to the movies as a family, and I would come home and I would pick out melodies from the incidental music on the piano, and because it was just stuck in my head. My mom played the piano, and I classical piano, and so I grew up sitting by her side, listening to her play a lot of Chopin. Again, the French music that I was referring to, the Impressionists, and this kind of thing is music I grew up with. And then I was tuned into the radio all the time. There was the radio show that had the Frank Sinatra Hour on I don't know what day of the week, but I would listen to that. I watched a lot of musicals, so I grew up with Barbra Streisand and Mitzi Gaynor and Fred Astaire. And then I think that everything integrated, and I found my way into jazz, but not by direct line. I had older brothers and sisters, so I was exposed to more American hippie music, so I grew up on Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and I really wanted to be like my older siblings, because everybody does, and they were quite a bit older than I was, so I thought they were very cool, and I was listening to their music, and Cat Stevens and Joni Mitchell and all of this, but mixed in with the musicals. And then a turning point happened for me, which was that a friend was playing the Getz Gilberto record. So I was at a friend's house, and he put on Stan Getz and Joel Gilberto, the famous, the classic record. This is so many people's way into music and into this field. And I heard that, and I just went, what is that? I loved it. I didn't get it, but I heard this voice and guitar of João Gilberto, and I was completely hooked. I think there was something in that music that really spoke to me, without me being able to describe it at the time. But, you know, I was an optimistic and sort of happy, sad little kid. I was melancholic and optimistic all at the same time. I can't explain why, I just was. But this music, without me understanding it, really grabbed me. And my dad lived on 66th Street, just a couple of blocks away from Tower Records. And Tower in those days was just vast. It was such a candy store, you know, for a music lover. And I would go in there, and they had a section of Brazilian music, and because I knew João Gilberto's name, it led me to buying other things. So I was picking up things like João Gilberto and Tom Jobim, and it led me to so many other Brazilians along the way, along with my Carole King records and Ella Fitzgerald records. And I don't think I was a kid with the kind of mind or curiosity to care or ask what the genre was. I just don't think I was terribly concerned with genre. I think I just heard what I loved, and it spoke to me, and that was it. So I was listening to all this music for years and years, way before I knew that I would become a singer. You know, I went to college and I got a degree in literature. So I had no idea that I was going to sing, but I think I was quote-unquote studying music all along because I just listened to so much music. I was devouring it, and so I think I was working behind the scenes unconsciously for all those years.
The one thing that's very key in your development and your biography lineage is that you go to London, you fall in love with your future husband. Lots of things happen in London. You had mentioned being in those coffee shops with 17 people there, but that was really a springboard for you. Talk to me about how important that London chapter in your life was.
Yeah, that was hugely important. What's so great about the London chapter, and I think that changed not just my musical path, but also my view in life in general. When you're young and you're a kid just graduating from college, and anything can happen. Anything can become a springboard for something else that leads you onto another unknown path. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, I wasn't planning on staying in London. I happened to be there for a year after I had studied in Germany. I was working on my German because I was a language and literature student, and so I was studying German, Italian, French, Portuguese. I had all this language study behind me, and that was where it was going to lead me towards my master's. And I went to visit some friends in England, and I needed a break because I had done 4 years of undergrad. I had already started working towards my master's. I was doing spending every summer in between my college years at Middlebury in Vermont studying at the language courses. I guess what I'm trying to paint the picture of is that I was a little burnt out and I needed a break, and I went to London really just to take a time out. And I didn't, I was in my early 20s and I didn't quite know what I was doing yet. The reason that is so key is because I ended up auditioning on a course at the Guildhall School of Music, which was just a 1-year postgrad course. That's a very safe thing to do. It was a 1-year course. I thought, well, I love music. They're probably not going to take me anyway. I hadn't studied music in any sort of official capacity. I hadn't studied it at college. I was in another field altogether. But I auditioned and I got in. And this was all so impetuous. And I got this visa to stay as a student. And word of mouth started to spread about me because when I was at the college as a student, people often call the colleges and ask kids to come in and play for their private parties. So I was getting party invitations to come and sing with other students at the Natural History Museum or British Telecom Tower, all these kinds of things. And I got this job in this cafe where they hired me twice a week. I kept getting these calls asking me to do things, and I didn't think I was staying. I didn't think I was staying because I figured, I came from this particular background, and I thought I would go back and do my studies and get a job somewhere in the academics. I didn't quite know, and it's so long ago I don't really remember, but somewhere in the academic field. And so when I started to sing and word of mouth started to spread about me more and more, and a lot of things started to happen. I made a demo at the college, and so I sent that to 3 people, and all 3 of those people I sent it to led to something else. One was the Richard III film with Ian McKellen. One was to Humphrey Littleton, who played me on the radio and said, "Watch out for this girl." And it was just a demo. I wasn't really expecting anything. And one was to a guy who has since died, but he was at Polygram Records at the time. Then I got introduced to Candid Records, and they signed me for a record deal. So, I don't think I was terribly hungry in terms of my career. I did a few little things, and it kept building. And that's what left me with this philosophy that, you don't know who you're going to meet any time in your life who's going to change your life. Jim obviously changed my life because I met him at the college and we got married right after college. But I had no plans on doing this, and it kept happening to me. So I became kind of this fatalist. I thought, well, maybe I'm just meant to be on this path. So those London years were very important to me. And I also, because I was getting all these jobs sort of around town, I was getting to play with repertoire. I was getting to know myself as a singer and be playful. And I think those were really important. So, I really love the pace of my own career, if I can put it that way. That nothing huge happened to me all at once. It's not like I was on television and then boom, the next day they said, come and be a star. I think I would have not dealt with that well. I think this thing gradually just grew and grew and grew until, then I got a tour offer to come to Sweden. This guy was in the audience in a little London club and asked me to come and tour for 3 weeks in Sweden. He was a promoter. And then Ronnie Scott's hired me for the opening sets. And then they said, it was kind of one of those lines, kid, a lot of people come and see you. We're putting you in the main slot. And then it just kept growing until suddenly I was in, 20 countries and then 50 countries. And I don't think I had never really planned it. It grew at a great pace. And I think that allowed me to grow along the way. And that's been very important for me.
Speaking of growth, one of the biggest growth spurts that you can have either as a performer or a listener or a fan is the shows you see live. Early on in your life, what jazz show did you see that really moved you?
I saw Art Blakey when I was in Germany, and that was amazing. Yeah. He was towards the end of his career and life, and I was just a kid. I found that tremendously exciting. And when I was in New York, when I was at college, I saw so many good things.
What I want to ask you now is, generically, why do you love jazz?
It's interesting that you asked me about why do I love jazz. It's a vast category. And I talked about being a kid and not really paying too much attention to category. And I think even to this day, I don't pay that much attention to category. I love music. I love music every single day of my life. It is in my head and it is in my life day and night. And even when I'm off tour, it is such a huge part of my life. I wake up and I go into the kitchen and Jim's making coffee and I pick up my guitar and he picks up his flute and we start playing and we talk about it and we put it on. It's hard for me to answer and say that it's jazz per se. And I realize that, this is a jazz show and we're going to talk about jazz. And I think that I do gravitate towards this genre more than others because quite simply, I love the harmony. The harmony speaks to me more than the harmony of a pop song. There are so many complexities to it. There are extensions in it that just, in a chord, that exhilarated me as a kid and still do today. And I wouldn't have been able to explain what was going on in the chord before. And yet I knew that it reached me in a way that maybe other harmonies didn't. And I love the groove. I grew up listening to Ella singing with Duke Ellington at the Côte d'Azur, and it had such a great groove to it that it just moved me. But this is where I have to stop and say, it's not exclusively jazz, because this is the genre that I sing, but I also, wake up and I go right to my Schubert. That's who I was listening to this morning, so that's why he comes to mind. So Brazilian music moves me, and all kinds of genres move me, and I spend a lot of time in my life listening to classical music and attending classical music concerts. And so it's not necessarily jazz per se that inspires me. I think that there's a lot of different kinds of music that feeds into the kind of music that I sing, which I think is what makes it interesting along the way, because we're all coming from these different lineages. I'm really inspired by the music of, I watch a lot of Satyajit Ray films, and I love Satyajit Ray's music. In those films, a lot of the music is his own composition, or Ravi Shankar is playing. That is a music that really speaks to me. And I think that it probably feeds into the kind of music that I play. You know, here's an example that people might understand even more. You know, if you take a director, a film director like Martin Scorsese, who can make these very intense and violent movies. Martin Scorsese's love of film, if you hear him in interview, there's so much variety in what has inspired him along the way. I heard him specifically speaking about his love of Powell and Pressburger, the British team who made things like The Red Shoes and I Know Where I'm Going. Great films from the 40s. And he talks about these being some of his favorite films. And you might not see that direct lineage inside his movies because they're so different in their texture and their sensibility. And yet it can't help but inspire him. So I am inspired by so much different kinds of music that will fuel the kind of music that I sing, even though it's not a direct line from one to the other.
So let me ask you this. This is my final question for you, and I want to know this. Everyone has a version or an interpretation of you. Your family, your friends, and your fans, but you know yourself best. So tell me, who do you think you are?
I think I'm very much connected to that little girl that I described earlier. You know, I grew up feeling pretty melancholic but optimistic, and I think I am still that person. And so I think that I found the right job, career path, and vocation, because I'm a person who loves to share and share beautiful things. And so to be on stage and say, listen to this, it's not even really, I'm the medium, but it's not so much look at me, it's listen to this that I think is so key. I think I'm a person who likes to make people feel better. I like to make people feel good and feel better, and I think that has always been at the center of who I am. If one of my friends wasn't feeling well at school, I have these vivid memories of sitting with them at lunch, and, you know, we were a group of caring little girls. I remember just whisper singing into one of their ears, kind of making her feel better when she didn't feel so well. I think that those kind of things that were who I was then are still who I am today. But you're right, we're different versions to different people on different occasions for different reasons. And that's what makes life interesting.
Without a doubt. Stacey, thank you for taking some time to talk about your world of music. I really appreciate it.
It's really a pleasure.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Japan, New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the globe, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Stacey for her time, her music, and story. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.